class held up in the head, and he turned away to do something else, and second thought he turned around and he would be against one guy and I held our hands up, but he didn't ask us why.
Yeah. No, the answers are obvious. They're destroying us and our lifestyle, and we know it. They want us poor. What they want is to eliminate the middle class, and we're just like.
And they want to suck the world out of America and spread it around the world.
Yeah, yeah. Especially spread it to their top line people here in the country.
After themselves, first they stuff their own pockets.
Yeah, and that's the way it is in every country where they've adopted this. I remember sometimes after Hugo Chavez died, he was the El Presidente of Venezuela. This probably 4 or 5 years after he died. There's a news thing about how his daughter had transferred, I believe, $5 billion to her account in Spain. I was thinking, I had to look her up and see, well, did she earn all that? She hadn't done squat. That's just money passed to her.
You wonder how that happened so rich. I know that higher deposit in Venezuela.
Yeah.
And rich or no, how in the world did they vote that?
Yeah. Well, they voted in the socialists. And so just if you read up on it, read some of the stuff they were saying before they were elected, they just out and out lied to the people, out and out lied, and they got power, and then the people were wondering what in the world happened. Oh yeah, it's definitely a sucker game.
And I don't think the people believe you'll never convince me that you're fair and square.
Yeah.
Basement.
I was
2 or 3 cars.
Yeah. I was watching Newsmax before we came, and they were talking to the governor of Virginia. He mentioned that if he was elected. Yeah, I had to cheer on that one. Yeah, he was. Yeah.
Oh, Yeah, let's go to 447.
Any prayer requests or praises for this evening?
The trouble keys seems to be doing better. So that he's doing stuff out and seems to be resolved.
Eugenia's gonna have a stress test, May the 3rd.
Yeah.
Other news and others.
More. Lloyd is still sick, so he's feeling a little better, but not up to making it tonight. So. I assume Don is most of it over. Anything else? All right, let's pray. Lord God, we come before you and thank you that we can present our requests and our hearts to you, and that you hear us as the one who is with us in all things, who is holy and dwells in unapproachable light, and yet is intimately involved in every aspect of our lives. Lord, we just thank you that we can turn to you, that as we experience relationship with you through Christ and through your Holy Spirit, we can come to you boldly and make requests of you. And we know, Lord, that you hear us and that you are a God who answers prayers and delights to commune with us through prayer. And so we come to you, Lord, in that spirit now, and as a community of believers, as the body of Christ, we just thank you for this privilege that we have. Lord, I praise you for this team who's doing better, and just pray that that would continue to go well, and then ultimately this team and the whole family would have hearts that are softened to you and to your Son and to your word, and that you would just bring about reconciliation, obedience, and joy to that family. And we continue to pray toward that end. Lord, I pray for Eugenia as she's going to undergo this stress test on May 3rd. Just pray that that would go well and deliver the results that they need to move forward with her and her treatment. Lord, I just pray for everyone who is struggling with allergies or other forms of sickness. And I pray for Lloyd, who wasn't able to be here with us tonight, and just pray that you would continue to help him to get better and recover back to normal. Pray for all who are struggling with various ailments and illnesses and weaknesses of various sorts, that you would minister to them, help them to look to you as the source of ultimate strength during their time of weakness, and to appreciate you for the gift of healing. And when it comes, Lord, pray that we would all realize how much of a gift it is to have good health. Help us not to take that for granted when we have it. Lord, I just pray that you would bless our time together this evening, and that you would help us to think richly about the history of your people, so that we can follow you faithfully in the times that you've placed us in. Pray in Jesus' name. I guess I should have mentioned I got my lab results back for my next kidney appointment, which I haven't had yet, but I went ahead and got my labs, and my creatinine levels are apparently just the same as they were the last time, which I guess is good news. They haven't changed at all. If I'm correct that the levels last time were what I think they were, but in any case, I'm still, I guess, stage 2 chronic kidney disease, so it seems like things have just leveled out. So I am hopeful that the doctor will say that you can stop seeing me now, and we'll just assume that everything is leveled up. But we will see. Also, I should mention for the community VBS, Pastor Caleb at the Nazarene Church reached out to me about our church being involved in the memory verse station. I think actually since then, someone else volunteered, another church volunteered, but there's 2 other things that basically there's 5 or 6 things that churches need to sign up for, and the idea is to have one church do each one. And so I think snacks and games are still needed. So if anyone is interested in being involved there, please let me know, and I can get the email to you for that. The meeting, or the next meeting that you need to go to if you want to be involved in this, takes place on May 1st. Unfortunately, the email didn't say where this meeting is, but I can put you in contact with you. So, if you're interested in that, please do let me know, and we'll announce that on Sunday as well.
Is there additional on the day?
I think it's during the daytime. I don't know for sure what they were planning, but
I'm sorry.
It's gonna take a while.
Not.
My question is, do they, the church that does snacks, do they have to provide all the snacks? Pay for them, or is there some time?
I'm not sure.
Probably we have to serve
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
them. Serve them and provide them, or just serve
Yeah, I wondered that myself. I would assume that that group is taking over snacks, providing and serving. That would be my assumption. All right, well, I need one volunteer to read a passage of scripture for tonight. So, Brad, Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Luke 18, 1 through 8.
Then Jesus told the disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, "In a certain town was a judge who neither feared God nor cared about men. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him, "Please, grant me justice against my adversary." For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, "Even though I do not fear God or care about men, yet because of this widow who is bothering me, I choose to get justice so that she won't. This is where we are." The Lord said, "Listen to that. Look at what an unjust judge says. Will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will you find faith on earth?"
Okay. So, God, of course, is the perfect judge who delights to give justice. So, we should come to him with our requests, especially in, I think, our adverse circumstances. Pray to him. But the reason why I selected that passage, perhaps more than anything, is because of the way Jesus concludes it. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? And that is a challenging question, I think, to any age of the church. How much faith do we have to persist, for instance, in prayer, and to trust that God hears us and that God is interested in answering our prayers for the sake of justice and for the sake of his kingdom? So today we are actually beginning to discuss the 19th century. We've been looking at the 18th century the last handful of weeks. We're looking at Baptist history in the 19th century. And this century has been called the Great Century for Christian Advance. Not just Baptist, but Christianity in general. But as we'll see, even in centuries of extreme promise and when everything seems to be going good for the church, there are challenges. And I think Jesus' challenge rings true in this century just as it does in others. So trust that we'll see that as we consider. But Lynn, you can go ahead and bring up the first slide. I want to start with just sort of an overview of this century and look at what's going on with the Baptists and the wider world during the 19th century. So, anyone know who the person in the picture is? It's a young Queen Victoria. So, much of the 18th or the 19th century was the Victorian age, and so she reigned from 1837 to 1901, and she was largely associated with what became known as the Age of Reform. Slavery was notably dealt with during the 1900s. Public education was dealt with in the United Kingdom during this period. It was just considered an age of reform. And Baptists found themselves right in the middle of all of this, of course. Baptists, notably during the 19th century, found themselves admitted to the major universities in England for the first time. And this was mostly a blessing, but it was kind of sad in part because Baptists had to kind of found their own colleges. And so a lot of people were leaving the Baptist colleges and going to these other places. And so as one thing was good for the Baptists, they could go wherever they wanted. Another thing wasn't quite so good for their institutions. But generally, this was a good thing for the Baptists as they had newfound freedom. Baptists were able to hold military commissions during this time in England. They held political power, and so their influence became widespread in that sense. And also, certain Baptist preachers became prominent on a national scale. So whereas before Baptists were kind of, mostly doing their own thing and no one knows about them, all of a sudden you have Baptist preachers who are known across the country. And anyone want to throw out the most famous Baptist preacher in England during the 19th century? It was, you probably recognize the name, it was Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon. In fact, when one young girl was asked, who is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom? She said, Mr. Spurgeon. But he was just so famous and easy for us to see or to overlook this fact, but he was famous really in all the English-speaking world. During the 19th century, the Baptist Missionary Society thrived. We saw this as we looked at the end of the 18th century as William Carey and his friends founded this missionary society. One other thing that was good for Baptists during this time in England was that particular Baptists and General Baptists joined. So they laid down their long held differences and they kind of joined together. So that was a very good thing. But one of the downsides of that was something that followed called the downgrade controversy. And this was actually one of the, this actually could have driven Spurgeon to his grave. He didn't live to be an incredibly old man, but he was involved in this downgrade controversy. And his concern was that Baptists had started to toss aside doctrines that they once held dear so willy-nilly that they had essentially rejected the gospel itself. And so we'll consider this controversy in the coming weeks. But with one good development can come sort of an overreaction to what had been. We care about our doctrine so much that we're in separate groups, and then all of a sudden you're like, hey, we're probably overly divisive. They came together, but they lost all passion over their doctrines that they once held so dearly. So neither extreme is good. But in the United States during this century, the War of 1812 really acted to confirm America as a nation, whereas the Civil War, which occurred in the late 50s and early 60s, served to establish that the nation could exist as one nation. Baptists, similarly, during the century, formed national unity, whereas they had been sort of separate before, just doing their own thing in the United States. They came together, and from the years 1812 about to 1832, Baptists formed a national entity. And so they were working together. This was an incredible thing. However, such was not to last. Anyone know why?
Civil War.
What's that?
Civil War.
Civil War, yeah. And what in particular happened?
The Baptists in the South defended slavery.
Right. The Southern Baptist Convention was formed. And so, of course, this is not really an upside of our history, but neither do Southern Baptists hold to slavery today. So it's an unfortunate aspect of our past, but it is something that happened. So, unfortunately, during this time, Baptists determined, they said they weren't overly against each other. We shouldn't think of that when we think of the split of the Baptists between North and South. What they said was, we're still brothers, we're just separate. We have disagreed on this specific issue, and so, whether you can hold slaves or not. And we're still brothers, though. And unfortunately, over time, this sort of we're brothers thing really worked itself out the way it did with a lot of people in the United States during the Civil War. It was like, oh, yeah, my brother lives in the South. And then you find yourself trying to kill him as you're in war together. So this we're still brothers thing kind of led to some divisions between North and South. But in the North, one of the challenges for the church for the Baptist church was Europe flooding into the nation during the 19th century, and most of these immigrants had really little familiarity with evangelical Christianity, so they're used to more like state churches and official types of Christianity, think high church, robes, and all the sort. So they come to America and they see people worshiping like we do, and they're like, what's going on here? And this was actually kind of a hindrance to Baptist witness. What Baptists and others did during the century to try to extend their reach and become more relevant was they adopted something called the social gospel, which was an effort to try to meet the needs in the industrial world, especially in the cities. The problem with this, kind of like the downgrade controversy, was that a lot of people embraced the social and left behind the gospel in the process. So what started as a desire to engage the needs of society, in some cases lost sight of what the gospel was. In the South, Baptists had, I think, a little bit better of a time. Most of the immigrants that came to the South were of a Scotch-Irish background, and these people, as opposed to the immigrants in the North, were familiar with evangelical Christianity, and so when they came, this wasn't such a foreign concept, and many people started joining the Baptist churches and even experiencing conversion. Camp meetings were a big deal in the 19th century for Baptists and others, and this proved beneficial to the church. Baptists in Europe kind of lagged behind, you could say. In America and in England, Baptists have struggled long and hard to achieve religious liberty, but in much of Europe, they still didn't have this religious liberty. They still struggled with state churches and civil governments restricting their rights. By 1900, however, the West achieved a great many freedoms that had been achieved elsewhere. However, in the East, Baptists faced a really, Eastern Europe, Baptists faced a really significant problem. You want to take a stab at what that is? Late 1800s, East. Baptists and other Christians faced communism, and much to be learned, much we will learn and think about, as I think certain similarities to our present day, but this was, as one historian put it, the greatest challenge to the Christian faith since the Roman Caesars, the rise of communism. And sort of understanding the censorship that went along with this and the sort of trying to force everyone into the same mold. I think there's certain overlaps. I don't think it's the same thing as what's going on. I certainly hope it doesn't become the same thing as what's going on in our world today, but many things that are parallel, and we can learn from those who lived as Christians during that time period. So what I want to do with the rest of our time is just start to think about what was going on in Great Britain and specifically England. And what I want to do is just focus on a couple of social issues and what the Baptists did, and this potential in dealing with social issues to divide the church, sadly, and much to be gleaned from this, because I think arguably what divides the church more than anything today still are social issues, aren't they? You think about the recent controversies in the SBC. Biggest thing probably has been critical race theory, social issues. What do you think about that? How do we respond to them? And so we would do well to learn from those who have gone before us. So Lynn, you can go ahead and, oh, well, I guess we missed the next slide. Well, you can go to the next slide, but that's Victoria. That's the first known photograph of Victoria with her oldest daughter in the 1840s, I believe, as photography was a new thing. But next picture is William Ward. William Ward was an associate of William Carey, and I bring him up now because he actually began his ministry as a speaker and a writer against slavery. And next slide is another person who was known as a Baptist who opposed slavery, named William Knibb. He lived from 1803 to 1845. He was a missionary to Jamaica, and he was incredibly passionate about blacks being treated with equal human rights to all other people. And when freedom was achieved for the slaves, he was a big factor in helping many to adjust to their newfound freedom. He was perhaps best known for a particular service where they celebrated at midnight on the day that slavery was outlawed, this abolition. And what he did was he took leg irons and shackles that would trap and hold a slave, and he took them and he put them in a coffin, and at midnight they buried the coffin, and they shouted aloud, "The monster is dead! The monster is dead!" And so if you go to the historic Baptist Church House in London today, there will be a picture of William Knibb and some of these shackles next to him, next to his picture, to commemorate this service. But a huge advocate for human rights and voice against slavery. So I mentioned the social issue, well, and then I said that it caused some division. You might wonder how it did. Well, the British Baptists kind of got a righteous older sibling complex. Remember, Baptists started in England, and so they wrote to the Baptists in America and they said, hey, we've handled this issue. what's your deal? You Baptists need to start treating this more seriously. And so they sent this letter, and the response they basically got was, well, things are a lot more complicated in America. I'm not sure we can just deal with this the same way you did. In fact, one quote from a letter in response went so far as to say, quote, they cannot interfere with a subject that is not among the objects for which the convention and the board were formed. So in other words, slavery stinks, but this isn't what we're about. And it was kind of an unfortunate thing to say, I think, for Baptists. But that was the attitude, not of everyone, certainly, but of some. And so they sent that letter back. In late 1834, the very next year, the Baptists really got their righteous holy sibling complex and sent some delegates from the British Baptists to America to promote the sacred cause of Negro emancipation, to use a quote. And this eventually led to Baptists in America facing this issue. Like, okay, our righteous older brother is telling us we've got to do something. Some people said, yep, we definitely do. And other people said, not so fast. And this led to the Great Schism that led to the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. So that's one social issue. The other social issue is temperance, or the abstaining from alcohol. And many pastors during this time, both in England and in the United States, advocated total abstinence from alcohol. So as people were concerned with slavery, so people, many of the social justice warriors of their day were against alcohol, which I know is very hard to think about given what you think of when you hear social justice today. But these two issues, slavery and alcohol, were very connected for a lot of people. So a lot of churches during this time changed from, in the Lord's Supper, they changed from wine, which was typical, to grape juice. And we still do this today. Most churches, in fact, don't serve wine, they serve grape juice. One of the outspoken Baptists against alcohol was a man named Charles Stoffel, and he was actually outspoken about a great many things. One thing that I found kind of ironic about Stoffel is that he would publicly denounce certain pastors whom he knew who drank alcohol, but he was a chain smoker. So he's like, now I know this pastor over here, and he's just smoking away at the cigarettes. Of course, smoking was seen very differently in that age. But he spoke against alcohol. He also spoke against excessive labor hours, and he was part of something called the Early Closing Association, which advocated for no more than 40 hours of a work week. And the reason why he advocated this was because he said people need family time, they need personal, physical well-being and spiritual well-being. And if they are working all the time, they simply can't obtain those things. He was also against opium traffic, aggressive war, and corrupt government. It's a very outspoken voice. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of Stoffel to show. So with slavery, there was this discord among Baptists. With temperance, there was as well. So the British, remember, they came and rebuked the Americans for being slow on the slavery issue. Well, the Americans decided, we don't have to take that. So they rebuked them right back, and they said, you Brits seem to have a problem with alcohol. And so they rebuked them right back over alcohol. And as the historian W.T. Whitley said, this caused, quote, a greater breach between the two groups than had the Revolutionary War. So unfortunately, British Baptists and American Baptists found a lot to fight about when it came to that particular issue. So what can we take away from the things that we've considered here? Well, I started by saying that this was the great century of Christian advance, but very important for us to remember that every century has its problems. And so Christ's warning, will the Son of Man find faith when he returns? I think applies to every generation. And I think it's very important for us as Christians to know who we are and therefore how we respond to certain issues in our world. And I think some of the Southern Baptist leadership that has tried to address the things that threaten to divide us have done so, pretty well from what I've seen. And that is essentially, regardless of what critical race theory says, the ultimate concern is what does the gospel say? And what the gospel says should drive the way we act. It should not keep us from acting just because other people are acting from a different agenda. Certainly shouldn't do that. But those other agendas also shouldn't reshape the gospel. And we learned that from the social justice movement that did away with the gospel. Ultimately, we are defined by the scriptures, especially the New Testament, and should seek to be involved in the world of that light. With that, let's pray.
No. Just regular.